The Germans had a method, always the same. Continuous bombardment, constant pressure, exhausted cities. And then came the signal. Production falls, transport fails, the population panics. The government starts looking for a way out. It was the same in other places. That's what the German High Command expected to see this in England. But week after week, that signal didn't come. The reports arrived cold, objective, and deeply irritating. London had been hit again. Docks destroyed. Entire. Neighbourhoods on the ground, Coventry in ruins. It was all there, but right below came what nobody wanted to read: restored railway lines, subway operating, factories resuming shifts, military production still active, not in words, on paper, in numbers. What began to weigh on people wasn't the destruction, it was the routine, because for those analysing the war from a distance, a country that works after entire nights under bombs isn't on the verge of surrender. It's made up its mind. And this conclusion began to take hold in the rooms where the strategy was being planned. There was no dramatic moment, no historic meeting with memorable phrases. There was silence. There was discomfort. There was the unsettling realization that something had gone wrong. The air campaign wasn't breaking England, it was being absorbed by it. Each attack that didn't cause collapse made the following week worse for the attacker. And then came the hardest realization of all. Time was not on their side. The more England resisted, the clearer it became that there would be no forced negotiation, no surrender through exhaustion, no quick victory. The country had chosen to continue, even knowing the price. This video is about that exact point. The moment when the numbers, the reports and the facts forced the German High Command to accept what it didn't want to admit. England wasn't waiting for the war to end. It was prepared to go through it entirely. And when that became clear, the course of the conflict had already begun to change. If you were in their shoes, looking at these cold reports after weeks of bombing, what would you think, seeing that England continued to function as if the war hadn't broken it? At what point would you realize there would be no surrender, that this country would go all the way? If this story captivates you, makes you think, and helps you understand the war beyond the books, leave a like now. It shows that this type of content deserves to continue. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that reveal what is almost never told. And comment below which city you're watching from, because this war was lived on real streets by real people, like us. Before any bombs fell on London, before the sirens, the makeshift shelters and the sleepless nights, the war against England was already decided in the minds of those planning everything on the other side of the channel. And that's what many people don't understand. For the German High Command, England was not seen as an enemy to be slowly destroyed, but as a country that was merely postponing the inevitable. France had fallen quickly. Holland, Belgium, Norway, all had yielded under military and psychological pressure. The reasoning was simple, almost automatic. England would be next, not because it was weak, but because, in their view, no modern country could withstand a continuous attack on its civilian heart without breaking from within. The German generals didn't talk about courage, honor, or resistance. They talked about numbers. Tons of bombs dropped per night, industrial production capacity, rail transport flow, civil morale measured by standards used in other countries. All of this was compared to recent experiences that had worked. The expectation wasn't an instant collapse, but a predictable sequence. First fear, then exhaustion, then popular pressure, and finally the government seeking negotiation. This script had been seen before, and for them, England had no reason to be different. There was also a clear political interpretation. England was isolated, without direct allies on the continent, dependent on vulnerable sea routes, with densely populated cities and a concentrated industrial system. In the German view, this was not a strength but a weakness. London, Liverpool, Birmingham, Coventry, names that on maps seemed like perfect targets to disrupt the country's functioning. The logic was cold. If daily life stopped, the war would end on its own. There would be no need to invade. There would be no need to cross the Channel. England would surrender from exhaustion. The most important thing is to understand that at that moment, there was no real doubt within the German command. It wasn't a risky plan. It was seen as the natural continuation of a winning streak. The air campaign wasn't treated as a gamble, but as a method that had already been tested, refined, and was reliable. When the first attacks began to be planned, the tone wasn't one of concern, but of confidence. They spoke of weeks, not months, of sufficient pressure, not prolonged resistance. And that shaped everything. It shaped the initial intensity of the attacks, the choice of targets, and above all, the psychological expectation. The reports that would be analyzed later were not open to surprises. They had a clear function: to confirm that the plan was working. Nobody expected to discover anything new about England. They only expected to record the moment when it would begin to give way. This detail is crucial because when you enter a campaign believing the outcome is already decided, every piece of data that deviates from the norm starts out small, almost irrelevant. A delay here, an anomaly there. In the beginning, nothing seemed serious, but war doesn't break down all at once. It begins to crack silently, and what seemed like just another country about to fall was about to become a much bigger problem than any German general had calculated at the beginning. And that's precisely where the story begins to change tone. Because the first surprise didn't come from a major German defeat, nor from a glaring military error. It came from something much simpler and much harder to explain. Something that in the following weeks would begin to appear insistently in reports and increasingly unsettle those who believed that England's days were numbered. At the heart of the entire German strategy was a certainty that seemed too solid to be questioned. No society can endure for long when civil life is attacked every day. It wasn't a vague theory. It was something they believed they had proven in practice. The logic was straightforward, almost mechanical. If you deprive people of sleep, destroy their homes, disrupt basic services, and turn each night into a real risk of death, fear ceases to be individual and becomes collective. And when fear becomes collective, it puts pressure on the government. That was the point where, according to them, the war is decided. German strategists did not view bombing as simply physical destruction. The primary target was not isolated buildings, bridges, or factories. The target was their routine. The idea was to make the average citizen wake up defeated every day before even getting out of bed. The concept was simple to explain and brutal to execute. If the population can't rest, work properly, or feel safe anywhere, they start demanding a way out. Not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion. That's how they interpreted what had happened in other countries. Within this logic, London was not just the English capital. It was a psychological symbol, a large, dense city full of residential neighborhoods close to industrial centers. A place where a bomb didn't just hit a military target, but thousands of lives at the same time. For the German planners, this would accelerate the process. Each night of attack should increase the feeling that continuing to fight was futile. Each following morning should be heavier than the last. And here's an important detail. They believed that the civilian population was the weakest link in the chain. Armies can resist, governments can make speeches, but ordinary people have limits. That was the interpretation. Germany was betting that the English citizen, after weeks living in makeshift shelters, hearing explosions, seeing destroyed neighborhoods, would begin to lose faith not only in the war, but in the country's own ability to continue existing in that way. Therefore, the bombings were not random. There was a clear intention to cause emotional impact. Night attacks when people were at home, successive waves to prevent rest, targets near residential areas. All of this was part of a strategy designed to wear down, not just destroy. In the strategists' minds, it wasn't necessary to devastate everything. It was enough to create the feeling that it would never stop. The most dangerous aspect of this logic is that it seemed to make sense. In theory, a modern country depends on stability, transportation, energy, communication, production. If you constantly disrupt that, the system collapses. And when the system collapses, the pressure doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. That was the plan, not to conquer England with soldiers on the ground, but to force it to submit from within its own population. But there was a hidden error in that certainty, an error that didn't appear in graphs, nor in previous experiments, nor in military manuals. They were treating England as just another country under maximum pressure. They weren't taking into account a factor that isn't easily measured. How does a society react when it understands that there is no alternative but to continue? At first, this mistake went unnoticed. The initial attacks seemed to confirm everything. There was destruction, there was fear, there was shock. But soon strange signs emerged. Small, almost invisible, easy to ignore. Things that didn't fit the expected script. And it is precisely on these first signs, discreet but decisive, that the next moment of this story begins to revolve. Initially, no one in the German command panicked. On the contrary, the first reports after the initial bombings arrived as expected. High numbers of damage, affected neighborhoods, fires, victims. All of this confirmed the plan. However, mixed in with this data, observations began to appear that shouldn't have been there, and which, at first, were treated as unimportant details. Reports said London had been hit hard overnight, but then came an almost bureaucratic line. Transportation resumed operation this morning. In another document, it was mentioned that an industrial area had suffered considerable damage, but that part of the production had been resumed on the same day. None of this was highlighted. They were footnotes, technical observations, written without emotion. But for those who knew how to read war, that was already a strange noise. Logic dictated that after consecutive sleepless nights, the population should be disorganized, that workers would be absent, that the system would begin to fail in a chain reaction. But what emerged on paper was something else entirely. Short delays, temporary interruptions, quick repairs, nothing definitive, nothing out of control. The country seemed wounded but functioning, and that didn't add up. At first, the explanation was simple. It's still early. It was natural that the psychological impact would take time. The strategists believed that the real effect would come later, when fatigue had accumulated. So the attacks continued, more intense, more frequent, more focused. The expectation was clear. The next reports would finally show the fall that had been delayed, but subsequent reports did not bring about that change. They went on to record something even more disturbing: the adaptation faster emergency services. Repairs completed in less time, adjusted, routines. The population began to know exactly what to do when the sirens sounded, where to take shelter, how to return to work afterward. This wasn't heroism, it was organization. And organization under bombardment was the opposite of what the strategy anticipated. Inside the rooms where these documents were read, no one spoke of it aloud, but the feeling was beginning to change. It wasn't fear, it was unease. Because destruction is one thing. Watching the enemy adjust to destruction is something entirely different. Each passing week without collapse brought a silent question to the surface. What if that doesn't work? The problem was that this question had no official place at that moment. The plan was underway. The investment had already been made. To back down meant admitting error. So the data continued to be analyzed with the same old filter, trying to fit reality into the expected script. But reality insisted on escaping. And there was something even more disturbing in the reports. There were no clear signs of internal political pressure. There were no mentions of mass strikes. There were no signs of popular movements demanding surrender. The British government showed no signs of hesitation. On the contrary, everything indicated that the political system was absorbing the impact along with the population. For those who planned war based on psychological attrition, this was a serious warning. Because when a country continues to function even under constant attack, time ceases to be an advantage. It becomes a problem. And this understanding did not come as a sudden revelation. It came as a growing discomfort, difficult to ignore, impossible to resolve quickly. It is at this point that the air campaign begins to lose something invisible but decisive: certainty, the feeling of control. There was still power. There was still destruction. There were still bombs falling. But the confidence that all of this would automatically lead to surrender began to crack. And in the following reports, this noise would cease to be discreet and would begin to occupy more and more space in the decisions that were to come. That's when the Germans started looking less at the destroyed targets and more at the behavior of ordinary people. The situation became really difficult to explain because it was no longer a question of infrastructure, production, or logistics. It was about people who, in theory, should have been broke, and they weren't. Reports began to repeat themselves with unsettling frequency. After entire nights of bombing, the streets were filling up again in the morning. Workers showed up for their shifts. Children went to school when possible. Shopkeepers opened their doors, even with broken windows and cracked walls. Not because nothing had happened, but precisely because too much had happened to pretend everything was normal. And yet, life went on. This wasn't theatrical courage, it was a practical decision. People knew that if they stopped, the attack would have worked. And this realization began to spread silently, sleeping poorly, losing homes, losing neighbors. All of that was already happening. What didn't happen was the expected social collapse. There was no mass exodus from the cities. There was no widespread abandonment of industrial centers. What happened was adaptation. Air raid shelters became part of the routine. Crowded subway stations at night didn't mean empty cities during the day. On the contrary, at dawn, people would leave, often going straight from the shelters to work. Not because they were immune to fear, but because fear no longer decided everything. The fatigue was there, the tension was real, but giving up was not an option. For those observing from a distance, it was disconcerting. The German strategy was based on the principle that the average citizen has a clear limit to their suffering, that, once that limit is exceeded, they pressure the government for a solution. But what was seen in England was different. The longer the pressure lasted, the more automatic the collective response became. People stopped reacting emotionally to each attack and began to react in a functional way. The accounts spoke of entire neighborhoods organizing cleanups immediately after the bombings, of neighbors helping each other without waiting for official instructions, of fires being fought with increasing speed. This did not mean an absence of pain or trauma. It meant that the initial shock had been replaced by something more dangerous for the attackers: the normalization of war. This point is crucial. When a population begins to treat the attack as part of the routine, the psychological effect of the weapon diminishes drastically. Bombs still kill. They still destroy. But they cease to paralyze. And that's what began to appear in the reports indirectly, almost reluctantly, as if no one wanted to write it out explicitly. What was most disturbing for German strategists was realizing that civilian behavior wasn't distancing itself from the war effort. It was aligning itself with it. There was no clear division between the home front and the military front. The population didn't see itself as an isolated victim waiting for rescue. It saw itself as part of the conflict, and that completely changed the calculations. England wasn't reacting like a potentially defeated country. It was reacting like a country that had already accepted that this would be a long, hard and costly process, and that the only way out was to keep going. There was no enthusiasm, there was quiet determination, and that kind of attitude is almost impossible to break with just aerial destruction. This is where German logic begins to fail most visibly. Because when you realize that civilians aren't pushing the government towards surrender, but rather supporting continuity, the strategy ceases to make sense. It wasn't an official conclusion yet. There was still hope that it was temporary, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. And the more this behavior repeated itself, morning after morning, week after week, the more an uncomfortable and inevitable question began to form. If even the civilian population isn't giving in, exactly where is this war supposed to break England? This doubt, not yet openly expressed, would begin to weigh more and more heavily on the decisions that would follow. As the weeks passed, the German command's attention turned to something that, until then, had been considered almost automatic. British industrial production logic dictated that without factories functioning, without active shipyards, and without a constant flow of equipment, the resistance would collapse on its own. Armies don't fight without weapons, planes don't fly without maintenance, and modern warfare depends on an industrial rhythm. This was the point where, theoretically, everything should begin to crumble. But that's not what happened. The reports began to paint a disturbing picture. Factories hit overnight would appear days later, partially operational. Production lines were shifted, reorganized, divided. Night shifts emerged to compensate for interruptions. It wasn't perfect efficiency, but it was continuity. And continuity, in war, is survival. For the Germans, this was a serious problem, because the strategy wasn't just to destroy buildings, it was interrupt the flow, and the flow insisted on continuing. There was clear evidence of damage. No one denied it. Warehouses destroyed, machinery lost, workers dead or injured. But alongside all that, something else appeared that shouldn't have been there. Production was not falling at the expected rate. In some sectors, it stabilized faster than the planners had calculated. This broke the logical sequence of the plan, because while industry continued to breathe, the war also continued. The most frustrating thing was realizing that England wasn't dependent on a single center. There wasn't a switch that could be flipped. Off with a successful attack. Production was dispersed, adaptable, and increasingly intelligently protected. Smaller workshops took on the functions of large factories. Emergency repairs became routine. The system wasn't elegant, but it worked. And it worked under attack. To an outside observer, it looked like improvisation. To those on the inside, it was planned survival. England wasn't trying to win quickly. It was trying, don't stop, and that changed everything. Because the German strategy depended on a continuous decline, not on irregular resistance. Every week that production continued, even with difficulty, was a lost week for those betting on collapse. This point began to weigh more heavily than any speech or civilian behavior, because factories don't pretend, numbers don't lie. If planes continued to be produced, if ships continued to be repaired, if ammunition continued to arrive at the units, then the country was still functional, and a functional country doesn't surrender, due to psychological exhaustion alone. Within the German command, this began to generate a specific kind of tension. It wasn't hysteria, it wasn't despair, it was something more dangerous, strategic doubt. The question that arose wasn't, are we causing harm? Because harm was being caused. The question was, are we causing enough harm? And that difference is enormous. The more time passed, the clearer it became that the industrial impact was not keeping pace with the intensity of the attacks. England was bleeding, but it was not paralyzed, and in war that means the adversary still has stamina. Each report confirming the continuation of production weakened the idea of a quick victory based solely on bombing raids. This was one of the quietest and most decisive moments of the campaign. There were no big announcements nor any abrupt changes of plan at that moment. But it was there that an unsettling perception began to form. The heart of British industry was being hit, but it wasn't stopping. And if he didn't stop, the entire logic of the strategy would begin to crumble. Behind the scenes, this sowed a difficult-to-dispel unease. Because if neither the civilian population yielded nor industry collapsed, then England was resisting in a much more profound way than anticipated, and this realization would open the door to increasingly tense, riskier decisions, with consequences that the German command was not yet prepared to face. As the data accumulated, one point began to bother us more than the others. The panic that should have appeared simply didn't, not in the way they expected, not on the scale necessary to force a rupture. For those planning the campaign, this was almost as serious as a military defeat, because the entire strategy stemmed from the idea that collective fear, when pushed beyond its limit, transforms into political pressure, and that pressure wasn't materializing. Intelligence reports attempted to gauge civilian morale in various ways. They observed behaviors, the flow of people, the functioning of services and public reactions. What emerged was not indifference. There was fear, there was weariness, there were real losses. But there was not the kind of despair that paralyzes a society. There was no uncontrolled stampede, no administrative collapse, nor clear signs that the population was demanding an end to the war at any cost. This completely broke with the model that had been used until then. It was expected that, after weeks of nightly attacks, cities would be on the verge of psychological collapse, that hospitals would be overwhelmed beyond capacity, that basic services would fail in a chain reaction, that fear would spread visibly. But what emerged was something else entirely. A tired population, yes, but a functional one. Exhausted people, but present. Scared, but organized. And that's much harder to deal with than pure chaos. Within the German command, attempts began to explain this as something temporary. There was talk of initial resistance, of national pride, of a natural delay until the full effect appeared. The bet was that sooner or later fear would prevail, but week after week, this turning point didn't come. What came was repetition, the same sequence: attacks, damage, losses, and then continuation. The most disconcerting thing was realizing that the fear wasn't disappearing, but it was being managed. People knew they could die. They knew their homes might not be there the next day. Even so, they carried on. This didn't fit the models used by strategists, because fear there wasn't leading to surrender. It was leading to adaptation. And when fear ceases to be a trigger for collapse and becomes part of the routine, the psychological weapon loses its power. Bombings still cause terror at the moment of the attack, but this terror doesn't accumulate as expected. It dissipates the next day when life needs to go on. And this began to become clear, not in speeches, but in patterns. Always the same patterns. Another detail caught our attention. There was no rupture between civilians and the government. There were no clear signs that the population was turning against its leadership. There was no dominant internal narrative of betrayal, abandonment, or incompetence. On the contrary, even with criticism and tension, the political system continued to function. This closed an important door in German strategy, which depended on internal pressure to force decisions at the top. For those who analyzed this objectively, An uncomfortable conclusion began to emerge. The aerial terror was failing in its main objective, not because it wasn't violent, but because it wasn't producing the expected political effect. England wasn't experiencing widespread panic. It was absorbing the impact and moving on, and the longer this lasted, the harder it became to believe that a sudden turnaround was still to come. This was a silent turning point. There was no official announcement, no abrupt change in discourse, but confidence began to give way to frustration, because when fear doesn't break a society, it ceases to be a decisive tool, and the campaign was beginning to reveal a deep problem. There was no psychological shortcut to beating England. From then on, each new night of bombing carried a question that no one wanted to clearly formulate if neither fear, nor destruction, nor exhaustion were forcing surrender. What exactly could still work? This doubt, still contained, would begin to pressure increasingly difficult decisions in the following steps of the campaign. With this scenario solidifying, the German focus inevitably turned to British government. If the population wasn't giving in on its own, then the pressure would have to come from the top. The gamble was simple. At some point, civil discontent would force leaders to back down, to negotiate, to seek a way out. But once again, reality didn't follow the expected script. What the reports began to show was something disconcerting. There were no signs of political hesitation. Decisions continued to be made. Orders remained clear. The administrative machine showed no signs of paralysis. There was no vacuum of command, no visible public confusion, no contradictory messages coming from the center of power. For those who relied on internal pressure to create rifts, this was a serious problem. The British government wasn't reacting like a cornered government trying to buy time. It was reacting like someone who had already accepted the magnitude of the problem. The messages conveyed to the public didn't promise quick relief or easy victories. They spoke of continuity, of resilience, of getting through a difficult period. This matters more than it seems. When leadership doesn't create false expectations, it reduces the psychological shock when the situation worsens. And that's exactly what began to happen. It wasn't a theatrical stance, it was practical. The measures were harsh, direct, often unpopular, but consistent with reality. And this created a curious effect. Instead of increasing despair, it lessened the feeling of deception. People weren't being prepared for an imminent end to the war. They were being prepared to endure it. For those trying to break the country through attrition, this removed a key piece from the game. From the German point of view, this was deeply frustrating, because an aerial terror campaign depends on one basic thing, that the enemy believes the suffering is not worth it. But when the government makes it clear that suffering is part of the journey and that there is no immediate alternative, the equation changes. The population doesn't wait for the promised end to the suffering. They learn to live with it. Another detail began to weigh on the decision. There were no signs of indirect negotiation. There were no secret channels, no clear diplomatic retreats, no moves indicating a search for an agreement. This completely contradicted initial expectations. Germany expected, at the very least, ambiguous signals, something that could be interpreted as openness. But what emerged was closure, determination, continuity, and this was reflected in the reports indirectly, almost reluctantly. They didn't say, "The British government is standing firm." They said, "No relevant political change observed." This phrase, repeated several times, began to carry more weight than any description of destruction, because, in war, the absence of change is a powerful indicator. It means that the applied pressure has not yet reached the tipping point. The German command began to realize that it was not just facing a country under attack, but an entire system that had adapted to the idea of being attacked. Population, industry, and government were reacting in a coordinated way. Not perfectly, not without flaws, but coherently. And coherence under bombardment is extremely difficult to break. This understanding didn't emerge all at once. It formed slowly, reading week after week. Each report confirming British political stability weakened the hope that the air campaign would force a decision in the short term. And the clearer this became, the more uncomfortable it was to admit that the strategy needed to produce something that hadn't yet appeared. This is where the story takes on a different weight. Because when neither the population collapses, nor industry stops, nor the government falters, the war ceases to be a question of intensity and becomes a question of time. And time, at that moment, was beginning to seem like a dangerous ally for England. This was the point at which many strategists began to understand, albeit reluctantly, that they were not pushing a country to surrender, but testing the limits of a resistance that seemed deeper than expected. And in the next steps, this finding would cease to be merely a technical inconvenience and would begin to directly influence the strategic decisions that would follow. As it became clear that neither fear nor destruction nor political pressure were producing the desired effect, the Germans began to observe more closely how England was controlling information within its own country. And this became a sensitive point, because in previous wars, moral breakdown was almost always accompanied by confusion, rumors, contradictory messages, and a feeling of abandonment. It was in this chaos that the population began to lose its footing. But once again, this pattern did not repeat itself. What emerged was a simple, direct, and above all, stable flow of information. There were no exaggerated promises of immediate victories, nor attempts to hide the gravity of the situation. People knew that cities were being bombed. They knew there were deaths. They knew the danger was real, and yet the internal narrative didn't change every week. That's powerful. When the message doesn't waver, fear doesn't turn into confusion. For those trying to break the country from within, this was a serious problem. Because German war propaganda relied on an essential side effect, that the British population would begin to doubt what they heard, to distrust the authorities, to feel deceived. But what happened was the opposite. British communication didn't sell quick relief or imminent happy endings. It prepared people to continue living under pressure, and this drastically reduced the psychological impact of the attack. German reports began to record, indirectly, that there was no mass hysteria fueled by misinformation. There were no waves of panic caused by uncontrolled rumors. There were no clear signs of a communication breakdown. The population seemed to know what to expect, and when someone knows what to expect, the shock diminishes. The attack remains violent, but it ceases to be unpredictable on an emotional level. Another point that drew attention was the absence of internal messages that placed the population in the position of a powerless victim. The dominant tone was not one of continuous lamentation, but of shared responsibility. This did not lessen the pain, but gave a practical meaning to the suffering. And suffering with meaning is much more difficult to transform into revolt. For German strategists, this dismantled an essential part of the psychological campaign. Because aerial terror depends on emotional amplification, it needs each attack to generate more fear than the previous one. It needs the impact to accumulate. But when internal communication helps absorb the shock, the effect stops growing, it stabilizes. And a psychological weapon that stabilizes loses power over time. It wasn't about total censorship or absolute control. It was about consistency. The message didn't change according to the intensity of the attacks. This prevented the feeling that the government was lost or improvising. For those analyzing from the outside, this was clear in the patterns of reaction. There were no peaks of collective despair after major attacks. There was mourning, there was tension, but there was no mass emotional breakdown. This detail began to weigh heavily because it showed that England wasn't just putting up a physical fight. It was managing the psychological impact of war. And when a country manages to do this, the strategy based on terror loses its main advantage. The destruction continues, but the expected political effect does not materialize. Within the German command, this began to be seen as yet another difficult obstacle to overcome. There was no clear lever to pull. There was no specific point where pressure could be intensified to generate immediate collapse. Every aspect observed, population, industry, government, communication, seemed to be aligned to absorb the attack and continue functioning. This understanding did not generate an immediate decision, but deepened the frustration, because at that stage it was no longer just a matter of winning or losing an air campaign. It was about recognizing that England was facing the war as an ongoing process, not as a passing crisis, and that made each day of bombing less decisive than the last. It is in this climate of silent attrition, of frustrated expectations and results below expectations, that the campaign begins to enter a more tense phase. Because when the initial strategy fails to break the enemy, the next step is almost never simple, and the choices that would follow would carry an even greater weight, both in the military and psychological fields. With all these factors already evident, something began to impose itself almost inevitably on the German calculations. Time was ceasing to be an ally and beginning to turn into an enemy. The air campaign had been designed to be quick, intense, and decisive, not to drag on. Each extra week meant not only more bombs dropped, but more resources spent, more wear and tear, and above all, more proof that England was not giving in. Initially, prolonging the attack seemed logical. If collapse hadn't yet occurred, they just needed to tighten the pressure. However, as the days passed, this logic began to reverse. The longer England resisted, the better it learned to resist. Defences adjusted. Responses became faster. The population no longer reacted as it had at the beginning, and this created a dangerous effect for the attackers. The surprise disappeared. The reports began to reflect this change indirectly. They no longer spoke only of the impact caused, but of the impact that was no longer happening. Attacks that weeks earlier would have caused disorganization now produced more limited effects, not because they were weak, but because the British system was absorbing each blow better. In war, this is a clear sign that the adversary is gaining something precious, time to adapt. And time, in this case, favored those being attacked. Each extra day allowed for more adjustments to the air defense, more experience for emergency teams, more refinement in logistics. England didn't need to win the air campaign at that moment. It only needed to survive it, and surviving week after week was already a form of partial victory. For German strategists, this realization began to generate deep unease. The campaign, which should have forced a quick decision, was turning into continuous attrition, not for the enemy, but for both sides. However, in this type of war, those defending at home usually endure more than those attacking from a distance. And this was a difficult equation to ignore. There was also the question of resources: planes, crews, maintenance, fuel. None of that was infinite. Each lost mission, each downed aircraft, each pilot who didn't return weighed more heavily as the main objective, to break England, remained out of reach. Time, which should have been putting pressure on London, was beginning to put pressure on Berlin. This feeling didn't arise as panic, but as a silent shift in expectations. They no longer spoke with such confidence about an imminent breaking point. The predictions began to become more vague, fewer certainties, more conditional statements. This, in itself, already indicated that something had changed at the heart of the strategy. When time enters the game as a factor of doubt, the campaign ceases to be decisive and becomes risky. Another important detail is that England, by resisting for longer, made something clear to the whole world. It would not fall easily. This had implications beyond the bombings. With each week of resistance, the possibility of external support, new arrangements, and changes in the overall balance of the war increased. And the Germans knew this. They knew that a surviving England was a much bigger problem than an England destroyed quickly. This was a point where strategy really started to matter, because it was no longer just a matter of insisting or not. It was about recognizing that prolonging the campaign was strengthening the opponent instead of weakening him. And that's one of the hardest conclusions to accept in any war. From this point on, the air campaign ceased to be merely an attempt to break British morale and became a test of limits of resources, patience, and strategy. And when an operation enters this phase, subsequent decisions tend to be more tense, riskier, and more fraught with consequences. It is in this climate, with time increasingly working against the attackers, that the German High Command begins to approach an inevitable realization. Not yet fully admitted, not yet spoken aloud, but increasingly difficult to deny. And it is precisely this realization that begins to take shape more forcefully in the next phase of this story. At some point in this process, the tone of the reports began to change. Not explicitly, not with dramatic phrases or open confessions, but in the way the data came to be interpreted. The focus was no longer solely on signs of English collapse. It began discreetly to be recognized that these signs might not materialize. And that's a huge milestone in any military campaign, because it means the original expectation is being abandoned, even if no one officially admits it. Internal documents became more cautious. Where there had previously been predictions, there were now conditional statements. Where there had previously been talk of inevitable cumulative effects, there were now observations about unexpected resilience and impact below expectations. These, seemingly, technical expressions carry enormous weight. They indicate that the mental model used to plan the campaign no longer explained what was happening in the real world. The most uncomfortable thing was that there was no specific event to blame. It wasn't a major air defeat. It wasn't an isolated operational failure. It wasn't a gross execution error. The problem was deeper. England wasn't reacting as it should have, according to all previous experiences. This deprived German strategists of something essential: predictability. And war without predictability is dangerous territory. From that moment on, a silent division began to emerge between what was publicly expected and what was understood internally. Officially, the campaign continued. The attacks went on. The external discourse maintained confidence, but internally, the certainty that aerial terror alone would resolve the war was fading. Not all at once, but drop by drop. This type of perception doesn't spread quickly. It starts in smaller circles, in more technical analyses, in cautious comments. But once it begins, it's almost impossible to reverse, because each new report confirming British continuity reinforces the doubt. Each week without collapse deepens the feeling that something fundamental was miscalculated long ago. And there was an important psychological aspect to all of this. To admit that England would not collapse meant admitting that the war would be much longer and more complex than planned. This wasn't just a military issue. It was political, economic, and strategic. It completely changed the landscape of the conflict. It wasn't something that could be easily accepted. Therefore, the recognition didn't come as an announcement, but as an internal adjustment of expectations. The objective ceased to be forcing surrender and became something more undefined, more difficult to measure. When this happens, the campaign loses clarity, and campaigns without clarity tend to drag on, consuming resources and increasing risks. At this stage, the German High Command was no longer dealing only with England. It was dealing with its own initial misjudgment, because everything indicated that the attacked country had done something essential from the beginning. War accepted as a permanent reality. This is not a temporary crisis. And when an enemy does this, breaking them requires much more than bombs. This silent shift in understanding marked a point of no return. The idea that England would surrender under air pressure was, in practice, dead, even if it hadn't yet been officially buried, and from then on, every decision made would carry the weight of this uncomfortable realization. What would come next would no longer be about testing whether England could withstand another attack. It would be about deciding what to do when it becomes clear that they will withstand them all. From that point on, the campaign ceased to be merely an offensive against England and began to expose a serious internal problem within the German command itself, because when a strategy doesn't deliver the expected results, the next question isn't, is the enemy strong, but where did we go wrong? And that's always the most uncomfortable question. The original plan had been built on a string of recent victories. It had worked in other countries, so it should work again. But England didn't fit that pattern, and this began to generate a silent tension between expectation and reality. Some still argued that it was enough to persevere. Others already realized that persisting without clear results only meant accumulating wear and tear. This difference in interpretation wasn't overt, but it was there, in the subtext of the reports, in the cautious adjustments, in the increasingly less firm predictions. The hardest part was admitting that the mistake wasn't in the execution, but in the basic premise. The idea that continuous bombardment would automatically break the will to fight simply didn't hold true. And when one premise falls apart, everything else needs to be revised. But revising a strategy in the middle of an active war is not simple. It requires time, consensus, and above all, the courage to admit that the initial plan failed. Meanwhile, the campaign continued. Planes kept taking off, bombs kept falling, but now there was a different weight behind these decisions. It was no longer a matter of a few more days until collapse. It was about maintaining an operation that wasn't delivering on its central objective, and that's an enormous drain on any military command. Another factor began to weigh in. There was no clear alternative ready to replace the air strategy. A direct invasion of England was neither simple nor quick nor guaranteed. It required control that did not yet exist. This created an uncomfortable situation. The air campaign was not solving the problem, but abandoning the air campaign also did not seem viable at that moment. It was a strategic impasse. This type of impasse undermines decisions. Each new mission needed to be justified not only by the damage caused, but by the hope that at some point something would change. But this hope was no longer supported by solid facts. It was sustained more by necessity than by conviction. And this completely changes the way a war is conducted. Behind the scenes, it was becoming clear that England had achieved something rare, to force the opponent to fight without a clear solution. He hadn't won the campaign, but he had prevented it from being decisive. And in war, preventing a decision is often as important as winning a battle. This was a moment of profound psychological strain for those who had planned. Because realizing that the enemy will not give up brings not only frustration, it brings the awareness that the conflict will demand much more than anticipated. More time, more resources, more risks, and this awareness weighs heavily even before any concrete defeat on the battlefield. This is where the story begins to approach its most difficult point. Because when a command understands that the initial strategy didn't work, but still doesn't know what the next one will be, the war enters a dangerous phase. A phase in which decisions are made under pressure, without complete clarity, trying to recover an advantage that may never have existed. And it is precisely in this climate of impasse, doubt, and internal strain that the moment approaches when the realization ceases to be merely technical and becomes inevitable. At some point, English resistance ceased to be treated as a temporary problem and began to be seen as a permanent condition of war. This is a huge mental leap, because accepting this means abandoning the idea that there is a hidden button that, if pressed hard enough, will make the enemy yield. And that is exactly what began to happen within the German High Command, even though no one wanted to say it directly. The reports no longer attempted to predict when England would collapse. They began to describe how it was functioning despite everything. This changes everything. When the analysis stops looking for collapse and starts mapping continuity, the recognition is implicit. Collapse is not coming. The air campaign had ceased to be a bridge to surrender and had become just another element of a much larger conflict. This understanding brought a heavy, almost suffocating feeling. Because the German strategy depended on speed, it depended on closing fronts quickly to concentrate forces on other objectives. A vibrant, resilient and operational England was exactly the opposite of that. Not only did it refuse to fall, but it forced the German command to keep resources tied up in a campaign that did not solve the central problem. The most unsettling realization was this: each bomb dropped without provoking surrender weakened the strategy itself, not because there was a lack of destruction, but because the repetition without clear results exposed the limitations of the approach. Aerial terror, used in isolation, had reached its limit. It could injure, wear down, kill, but not decide. And that is a brutal realization for any command that bet everything on this method. There was also a reverse psychological factor at play. By resisting week after week, England not only maintained its own morale, but also sent a silent message to the enemy. This isn't working. This message didn't come in speeches or communiques, but in the simple continuity of life, production, and command. And this begins to erode the confidence of the attacker. Another point began to weigh on us. The war was becoming uncontrollable according to the planned terms. When you can't impose a quick decision, you enter a war of attrition. And wars of attrition favor those who can absorb losses without breaking the system. England was demonstrating exactly that. It wasn't immune to suffering, but it was structured to withstand it. This was the stage where the German High Command had to face a difficult truth. There were no more shortcuts. There were no more decisive psychological blows waiting to be discovered. The path ahead, if there was one, would be long, expensive, and full of uncertainties. And this was not the war that had been planned. The air campaign, which began with the promise of forcing a quick surrender, now served only to maintain pressure while other possibilities were considered. But maintaining pressure is not the same as winning. It's merely avoiding losing ground. And that's a much less comfortable position for those who started believing they had total control of the situation. At this point, the idea that England could hold out up to a certain point began to be replaced by something far more unsettling. Perhaps there wasn't a clear limit. Perhaps the country was willing to continue as long as it was physically possible. This perception changes the calculations of any war. Because when the enemy is willing to pay any in price, the cost becomes shared. This is where the narrative begins to close in on an inevitable conclusion, even if not yet officially acknowledged. England wasn't resisting out of necessity. It was resisting by choice. And that choice made the conflict something far more profound than an air campaign could resolve. In the next chapter of this story, this realization would cease to be merely an internal observation and would begin to influence decisions that extended beyond the Blitz. Decisions that would affect not only the campaign against England, but the broader course of the war, which was still far from over. With this understanding becoming impossible to ignore, the tone within the German High Command changed noticeably, not in public, not in official statements, but in internal language, in the most careful assessments, in the increasingly less optimistic conclusions. The talk was no longer about breaking England. The talk was limits, and when a military command starts talking about limits, it's because the initial trust has already been lost. The reports became more defensive, almost cautious. Where there had previously been certainty, there were now reservations. Where an inevitable cumulative effect had been projected, it was now recognized that this effect was dissipating. England was not collapsing. It was remaining functional under attack. This phrase, even when written technically, was weighty, because it meant that the main gamble of the campaign was not paying off. The hardest thing to accept was that this change wasn't accompanied by a clear alternative. There wasn't a new plan ready to replace the old one. There was only the silent recognition that insisting on the same approach wouldn't lead to a different result. This creates a dangerous strategic vacuum. When conviction disappears before the solution, each decision carries more weight than it should. This new tone also revealed something even more sensitive: respect enforced by English. Resistance, not a declared respect, but an implicit one. England ceased to be seen as a target about to fall and began to be treated as an adversary that did not easily bend. This change in perception is profound because it alters the entire understanding of the conflict. A weak enemy can be pressured until it breaks. A resilient enemy requires a different kind of war. Within this environment, frustration grew. There was no obvious error to correct, no simple flaw to adjust. The problem was structural. The air campaign was functioning exactly as planned in technical terms, and yet it was not achieving its political objective. This is the worst possible scenario for any military strategy. From that point on, each new attack was accompanied by a silent question. What exactly are we expecting to happen now? When this question starts to come up repeatedly, it's a sign that the strategic initiative is faltering. The campaign continued out of inertia, not out of full conviction, and wars, waged out of inertia, rarely end well. This stage marked an important psychological turning point. It was no longer a matter of testing English resilience. That resilience had already been demonstrated. It was a matter of deciding how far it was worth continuing to bet on an approach that clearly wasn't delivering the desired result. And this decision wasn't simple, because it involved publicly admitting something that, internally, was already clear. England, at that point, had achieved something crucial without winning a decisive battle. It had changed the way the enemy thought about her, and when that happens, the impact goes far beyond the bombings. It begins to affect priorities, planning, and future choices. The Blitz was no longer seen as the path to surrender, but as a chapter in a war that was proving to be long and unpredictable. This was the moment when the illusion of a quick victory finally dissolved. There was still no open confession, no formal announcement, but the conclusion was there. In the subtext, England would not be defeated by aerial terror. And accepting this meant facing a future far more difficult than anyone had initially planned. At some point, this shift in perception ceased to be merely technical and became a definitive understanding. There was no longer any way to pretend it was a delay, initial resistance, or a psychological effect that was yet to emerge. England had passed through the worst expected moment and was still standing. That was the instant when the idea of surrender simply came off the table, even if no one explicitly pushed it away. It wasn't a dramatic meeting, nor a historic phrase recorded in the minutes. It was something much harsher than that. The silent realization that there was no longer a plausible scenario in which England would surrender due to air pressure. The accumulated data left no room for optimistic interpretation. The population continued to function. Industry remained active. The government remained firm. Time continued to pass, and nothing indicated an imminent collapse. This moment is significant because it changes the nature of the war. Until then, there was an expectation of resolution. From then on, there was only continuity. And continuity in war means increasing cost. It means prolonged attrition. It means that every future decision would have to be made knowing that the conflict would not end quickly. For the German High Command, this was a profound strategic shock. The entire campaign had been designed to avoid precisely this type of stalemate. England was supposed to fall quickly to free up resources, time and attention for other fronts. What was happening was the opposite. It was becoming a permanent factor, impossible to ignore, impossible to neutralize with the means used until then. This understanding also brought something unsettling. England was not only resisting, it was imposing conditions on the enemy, not directly on the battlefield, but strategically. By not breaking through, it forced Germany to keep its forces tied down, to prolong operations, to accept attrition that was not part of the original plan. This is a silent form of power. At that point, the question was no longer whether England would give up, but how to deal with the fact that she wouldn't give up. This was a brutal shift in mindset. The war ceased to be a series of decisive blows and became a long-term conflict full of uncertainties and accumulated risks. And this demanded difficult choices, many of them unpopular within the command itself. The hardest part is that this conclusion didn't come with relief. On the contrary, admitting that England would fight to the end meant accepting that the conflict was only beginning to show its true scale. It meant accepting that no simple solution was in sight, and accepting that requires more than military calculation. It requires confronting one's own initial misjudgment. From that moment on, each new action ceased to be thought of as a step towards British surrender, and began to be evaluated within a much broader and more uncertain scenario. The air campaign was no longer the central solution. It was just another element in a war that was becoming long, arduous, and unpredictable. That was the moment when the phrase, "they won't give up," ceased to be a possibility and became an internal certainty, an uncomfortable, silent certainty, impossible to ignore. And when that certainty takes hold, it changes everything. It changes priorities, it changes expectations, and it changes the course of decisions that follow. In the next chapter of this story, this understanding would cease to be merely an internal conclusion and would begin to directly influence the course the war would take from then on, not only in relation to England, but to the conflict as a whole. When that certainty finally solidified, the impact was greater than any bomb dropped on London. Germany understood that England was not a temporary obstacle but a permanent problem, and this realization changed the course of the war. It was no longer possible to plan the conflict imagining a neutralized English rear. England would remain there, resisting, harassing, pressuring, interfering every single day. The conclusion was harsh because it offered no easy way out. If England was to fight to the end, then there was no quick victory, no psychological solution, no internal collapse to exploit. All that remained was a long war, with multiple fronts, increasing costs and accumulating risks. This demanded difficult strategic choices: where to concentrate resources, what to prioritize, what to accept as unsolvable in the short term. These questions weighed heavily on all subsequent decisions. More than that, England's continued presence altered the overall balance of the conflict. It remained an operational base, a foothold, a constant threat. Even under attack, it remained capable of influencing the course of the war. And this meant that any future plan would have to take into account the existence of an enemy that simply refused to leave the game. Most significantly, this conclusion was not accompanied by formal defeat. England had not won the war at that moment. But it had achieved something perhaps even more important, had eliminated the possibility of being defeated quickly. And in conflicts of this kind, everything changes. The side that needs to win quickly ends up bearing the weight of frustration. The side that only needs to resist gains time, and time in war is power. From then on, every German decision was made under a constant shadow. Nothing could be planned ignoring England. Nothing could be done counting on its imminent downfall. The conflict ceased to be a series of rapid campaigns and became a war of global attrition. A war in which mistakes accumulate, resources are stretched, and consequences appear long after the initial choices. This is the part that often gets lost when talking about the Blitz. It wasn't just an air campaign that failed to break a population. It was the moment when one side realized they were facing an opponent who wouldn't play by the expected script. An opponent willing to continue even when everything indicated they should stop. When the German High Command understood that England would fight to the end, the war ceased to be predictable. And unpredictable wars are the most dangerous of all, because in them, victory doesn't go to the one who scares the most, the one who attacks first, or the one who seems strongest at the beginning. Victory goes to the one who manages to continue when the original plan no longer makes sense. That is why this moment matters so much. Not as an isolated heroic gesture, not as a romantic symbol, but as a real turning point in strategic understanding. England was not waiting to be saved. It was not betting on a miracle. It was simply determined not to leave the war. And when that decision became clear to the other side, the conflict entered a completely different phase. From then on, nothing would be quick, nothing would be simple, and nothing could be resolved through terror alone. The war had found an adversary that would not back down. And this, sooner or later, would exact a heavy price from all involved. What did you think of this story? At what point did it become clear to you that England simply wasn't going to give up, no matter the cost? Leave your comment below, because every point of view helps keep these stories alive. If this content captivated you and made you understand the war in a different way, a like shows that this type of narrative deserves to continue. Subscribe to the channel to follow more real, human, and profound stories like this one, which go beyond books and show how silent decisions change the course of history.